Let's return to This Week in America. Here's your host, Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody, coast to coast, This Week in America. The World Health Organization estimates that half of the world's population is currently living in cities, and that number will continue to climb. Cities are often vilified in many stories as concrete jungles, slums, even seem terrifying to many. Cities are by their very nature split personalities. Many cities also are unique in that people gravitate toward them as centers of cultures and learning. Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems by B.W. Williams, is a collection revolving around life in the city during 4 seasons. B.W. Williams is a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. Employed by Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, the medical director for the Mount Sinai Unite Here Health Primary Care Center, which cares for the employees of the Atlantic City, New Jersey-based casinos and their dependents. He resides with his family on the Jersey Shore. B.W. Williams, author of Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems, is our guest on This Week in America. Dr. Williams, welcome to the program. A pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Rick. It's a pleasure for me and a privilege. And I first want to say, give my offer of prayers and thoughts for the folks in Florida who went through 2 devastating hurricanes. And I hope they have a rapid recovery and that people remain safe.
Well, thank you for those words. In our part of Florida, we got by. It was the tornadoes more than hurricanes, although people lost power for a while. Western part of the state, they're still recovering and probably going to be for some time as we get through that. Hopefully now the end of hurricane season and we can move on. And thank you so much for those kind words. I love what you've done in the book, Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems. I love the urban setting. I love big cities. You bring it to life in your short stories and poems. Talk about the story behind the book. How did you come up with this concept for Cityscapes?
I've lived in cities a good part of my life. I grew up in New England and lived in Boston for some time, trained in Boston in medicine during the height of the AIDS epidemic, and saw quite a few things occur. Heroic things and things that were challenging. And since then, I've moved around. I was living for some time outside of the New York area, in Connecticut, as well as visiting friends in Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Francisco, and of course in Miami. I think that for me, cities have always been a part of my life, an important part. And the cultural dynamics that take place in the city, the people you see, the circumstances, just walking down the street in New York, for example, hearing dozens of languages being spoken.
Yes.
And my own parents being from, a multicultural background. My father was from Cuba, my mom Jamaican. It just sort of brings to life a kind of worldview and a perspective that I think is hard to see in other areas, not just areas of life, but other areas of work or business, things like that. I think cities are almost like living organisms. They have a heart, they breathe, they think, and they act. And culturally, I think depending on where cities are, Atlanta is as different from New York as New York is from Los Angeles, but
Yes.
yet they all share a lot of commonalities. They share the same wants, desires, hopes, dreams. The people in them want a lot of the same things, but again, the cultural dynamics are different. Certainly going to a cookout in New York is a lot different than a cookout in Atlanta or South Carolina. The food is going to be different. The music is different, but that's what makes it fun. To me, that's engaging and it's exciting.
Our guest on the program is B.W. Williams. He's the author of Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems. Book available, of course, wherever you buy books. We've got a link on our website to his Amazon page. The book available, and I want to thank mainspringbooks.com for arranging our conversation with Dr. Williams today. As you started this project, what goals did you have in writing the book? And do you feel like those goals were achieved in the stories you tell in Cityscapes?
I think that most of the goals were achieved. My hope was to let people know, whether you live in a city or not, or whether the city is a large one or moderate size or modest size, that in the United States, we all have common interests. And as different as people perceive their lives to be, in many ways, a lot of us are connected to each other, one way or the other, and we depend on each other. For example, in a city like New York, it really relies on food services from outside the area, and it requires a constant upkeep of and maintenance of people who come in with different skill sets to maintain the infrastructure, the roads, and teach in the schools and so on. I think that for me, I love the United States. I've traveled around the country different ways, and I just want people to understand that we have much, much more in common than we do differences. And we all share a kind of common heritage that as Americans, we should be proud of. I think cities are really the embodiment of a lot of the good things that Americans harbor in their heart and in their minds.
B.W. Williams is our guest. The book is Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems. This journey for you, this writing adventure began, back in third grade. You get up, you've got a detective story that you've written. The class loved it. You got a round of applause, and suddenly you were hooked on writing. This is your first book. Did you ever think you'd get to this point in writing a book?
I was not sure, to tell you the truth, because from that first moment you described, I sort of had written off and on by in secret or in my off hours or early mornings. As a physician, especially practicing in general medicine, you're busy all the time, and it's hard to really get spare moments, especially if you live with your family and day-to-day activities like that take your interest away. But this has taken a couple of decades for me, and it's an accumulation of stories, compilation of different characters I've met across the years, both at my office and also friends of mine and personal acquaintances and family members. It's sort of like a combination of interesting aspects of the people I've met, and I put them into these characters in these stories. So, for example, I remember my wife and I were headed out of town when we were living in Boston during the early hours of the morning, and we sat waiting at the train station called South Station. And right there, I just started thinking about what it would be like if you had a couple that was sort of at the tail end of their marriage, waiting there. One of them hoping to rekindle something in their romance, and the other just looking to get out. What would that moment be like for them in the early hours of a Boston morning, late in the fall or early winter? And so that's how these stories came about. And I developed them over the years and refined them. Of course, as you know, it's always the rewrites that get you when you're writing. It's never perfect. It's never quite good enough. Even now, I look at these stories and I think there is something I could have done a little bit better. But I'm pretty happy with how things turned out.
And you should be. A job well done. The reviews have been excellent for Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems by our guest B.W. Williams. Talk about Shadow of Wings, one of your work in the collection. Talk about that. Here's this almost freedom. It's summertime. Summertime is different in the city, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think summertime is really a kind of interesting moment for most American cities, because it's when people who actually live and work in the cities escape, and it's when people from outside the cities come in to visit. So, for example, in Boston, Chicago, I'm sure LA, San Francisco, New York, a lot of the people who live in these urban settings, they find the summer as a time to escape and get away. While at the same time, people who live outside those cities want to come in and visit and tour those metropolises and just see all the interesting sights there. And so Shadow of Wings is really something that I envisioned while at Logan Airport in Boston, which is it's a unique airport because it's built on a series of harbor islands in the middle of the harbor outside of Boston Harbor. And because it's built on these built up islands, the airplanes that come in are coming in literally on the ocean, and they are landing on this thin strip of land surrounded by water. And so just sitting there waiting for our plane while we were traveling, we were one of those urban people getting away. It just sort of came to me that, these large iron and aluminum birds are whisking people away, but people have other dreams, about sort of mythical dragons or getting away to mythical places. And sitting at the airport in that particular summer day, I was thinking of those kinds of things and what people might be imagining in their own lives if they had free will and could just go anywhere they wanted. What would they do? And so that's how the poem sort of developed, and I kind of blended everything together.
As you read the collection put together by our guest, B.W. Williams, cities come to life, people come to life. We realize we're different, but we share so many commonalities. It's such a job well done in Cityscapes. You also make reference to a historical event, September 11th, 2001. If you're in New York City, certainly that's a date that will live forever. It will live forever wherever you live with different thoughts and memories. Talk about the poem that you have in there, Big Brothers.
Yeah, so, my wife and I moved from Boston to New York no more than about 6 weeks prior to September 11th, and we lived in downtown New York. So we'd only been in New York for a few weeks, and fortunately for us, our anniversary comes just a little bit before September 11th, and we were out of town on that day, but we saw the events taking place from where we were vacationing. And when we got back, we could see the devastation. And I remember as a child, my father taking me to the original World Trade Center site when it was under construction. Those were, back in those days, the 1960s, that whole area of Manhattan was filled with radio shops, radio stores. The first time I ever saw a color TV set was on what was called Radio Row near Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan. And all that area was dug out. And as a young man, a 6-year-old kid, I could peek through the window of one of the fences around the massive construction site. I could see this huge pit being dug out. And so I remember these buildings going up. And they just represented everything about New York that people loved and hated. This kind of image of a sort of overwhelming presence of concrete and steel, but this kind of magnificence in terms of financial and cultural dominance. And when they came down, and when we saw that same open pit surrounded by 10-story mounds of crushed steel, it was just something that overwhelmed me to the point where I just felt like I had to write something about the memory of those buildings and most importantly, the memory of the people who worked there and their families. And it just seemed to me to be important to document this in a way that people could sort of associate this years from now who would never have seen those buildings. Decades from now, people will look at it the same way we look at Pearl Harbor,
Yes.
where they just can't imagine what was there because they weren't even born at that time. So this is something for generations of people to look back on and sort of imagine how we felt at the time when the buildings were up and how we felt when they came down.
You're a very talented writer. You went to Harvard College on a scholarship, involved in theater and radio there. Writing was something that you were really interested in, but you really loved medicine, being a doctor. You went to medical school. What was it about the pull of medicine? And now you're sort of able to combine what you see in dealing with people, all types of people in your practice, and you can deal with that in your writing, which you do so well. What was the pull of medicine where you really wanted to help people? You were really driven by that instinct.
When I was a young man, and a young boy, I actually was quite ill. I had asthma as a young man growing up, and in those days there wasn't a lot to offer. I was in and out of hospitals and medical institutions, just trying to catch my breath, and I could see other people in the hospital when I was there worse off than me. And so I was introduced to medicine very early in life, in a way that was very personal. During that time, I sort of made a vow to myself that I would do everything I can to see that other people wouldn't suffer the same way I did. And if they were, that I could do something to ease their pain and their distress. And so, I was fortunate enough to be able to accomplish those things, but medicine was always kind of almost like a North Star for me, something that I was always going to do. And writing came about, as I mentioned, from a very young age. And I just loved being able to put thoughts on paper and ideas and come back to them later and refine them. Of course, as you go through life as a young man, you imagine all kinds of things. I at first thought, for example, I was going to be the world's first successful heart surgeon to implant a robotic heart and keep people alive almost forever when I was 12. And, I wrote stories about that. As I've gotten older and seen a lot of things, it's just come to mind that human behavior is something that is challenging, but amazing to me. It's miraculous. What people will do when they're under pressure, the sacrifices they'll make for themselves or for complete strangers. And I think we saw that in these last years of the pandemic. I remember the early hours. My wife is a nurse who worked in New York during that time, and people leaning out their windows at the change of shift of the nurses and just banging on pots and pans and yelling and, blasting music out into the street to celebrate them as they were leaving these hospitals, these devastating moments of seeing people, struggle just to breathe. So I remember all that. And it's just really something that is heartwarming and just gives me a lot of encouragement, a lot of hope that we're better than we think we are.
It's interesting, your perspective in New York City, what you went through as you interned in the early days of HIV/AIDS, what you went through during the pandemic, what your wife went through, traveling around all of the cities. How hopeful are you? And I think you just touched on that. You still think there's a commonality that will bring us all together. Give me your perspective in traveling, meeting people from all across the country, and your hopes for the future and us all working together for the common good of everybody.
I think that, from what I've seen, and I've spoken to people, I have friends in all parts of the country, people generally want to help you. And Americans, and I don't know about other countries, I'd assume the same thing, but Americans are unique. When they see their friend in trouble, they don't run away, they run towards them. They will generally give the shirts off their back to help them. They'll give complete strangers solace and comfort. They'll open their hearts. They don't ask you what your political affiliation is or what your religion is. Most Americans don't really care, unless you get into a conversation with them about that. When they see you in trouble, they want to help you. And the proof of that, I think, is in the large donations. Americans don't have cities with public squares or plazas dedicated to monarchs or kings or queens. They're dedicated to philanthropists, Rockefeller, or even Vanderbilt, or even the current crop of billionaires.
Yes.
I think that Americans at their heart are warm, generous people who want to help. and can see themselves in other people, whether the person's a different background or color or creed or gender. It doesn't matter. I do believe that, and I've seen that. I've witnessed that on the ground. I think that the perceived divisions that we have are just that. They're perceived, and that people will come together at the right time for the right moments for the right reasons. I'm convinced of that. And, I just hope that they take a look at the book and read the stories and, can envision themselves in some of these characters or friends of theirs, and they recognize moments in their own lives in some of these stories. That would be my hope.
It's a story of people. If you are a fan of cities, enjoy urban life. Cityscapes is an excellent read. Even if you're not, you'll gain a whole different perspective on what happens in a city and the mood of the city. I mentioned in the beginning, some people are terrified of cities. Why do you think that is, and what would you say to them so they would make when they visit a major city, they'll relax and enjoy the people and the culture there?
Well, cities are really a combination of neighborhoods. And so if you're from a small town, for example, and you enjoy, let's say, Italian food, well, if you go to Boston, the north end of Boston will be just like the neighborhood in your small town. And you'll see a lot of the same people, a lot of the same types of cuisine. If you enjoy Spanish food or Chinese food, you go to any Chinatown in any city, and you'll see familiar restaurants and people, but you'll see a twist on it. For example, if you go to Chinatown in Atlanta, you'll see Southern barbecue mixed in with, your traditional Chinese dishes. And if you go to Los Angeles and you are used to a small town or you enjoy certain baked goods, you'll find those kinds of things in small neighborhoods in these large cities. So cities are really made up of a collection of small neighborhoods. And if you go to these neighborhoods, it's really something built on a human scale. The streets are smaller, the buildings are human scale. And really, it's the downtown areas that I think most people think of, but most cities are really built of the neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods are much smaller in scope and much more on a human scale, and are easily identified by people even from small towns.
When I go to a big city, I love to find a park bench and sit for a couple of hours, which will turn into a couple of more hours just watching people and imagining all of their stories and going through what you and I are going through, different set of circumstances, but the same basic theme that they're going through. Do you do that? It sounds like you do that. You're a people watcher when you're traveling, watching people, and many of these people end up characters in your stories.
Absolutely. That is absolutely true, Rick. I remember sitting with my wife in Central Park and just watching people walk through and hearing the conversations they're having with each other. Some of them are, of course, very loud conversations,
Yes.
being New York, but some of them are just really endearing. For example, I think we were in, of all places, Las Vegas, and we were at one of the casinos, and we saw a young couple come down, and apparently they were waiting for, their company, and they had just gotten married. She was wearing the sash that said "just married," of course, and her mom had shown up, and she ran over towards her mom and hugged her, gave her a kiss, and tears were flowing down their eyes. They had an open conversation. Everyone could hear it. I guess the mom had just been through treatment for breast cancer and had survived it, and had only gotten out of the hospital a couple of weeks earlier and didn't think she'd be around to see her daughter getting married. So these are the kinds of things I think that are really heartwarming and grab your attention. And, you don't realize at that moment that you're in the gambling capital of the world. You're just seeing two people who are happy to be alive. They're glad to be where they are, and they're enjoying each other's company in a way that's profound. And I think that that's something that cities bring out in people, and the closeness of of companionship and the relative nearness of other people allows you to be able to experience their joy in a public way as well.
I want to take a couple minutes here at the end just to talk about your work. Primary care physician, you see the best and the worst of people, and so many people going through difficult times. It's how your presentation is, I assume, that they're going to walk out of there either feeling hopeful, feeling discouraged. Talk about how you balance all of that, the ups and the downs, and maintaining a demeanor that gives hope to the individual no matter what they're going through.
Yeah, Rick, it's a great question. I think anyone in medicine handles things in their own unique way. But for me, I think about the people and what they're suffering at the moment when they come in. And I really try to do whatever we can to be honest with them. I think most people, when they see a doctor, they're worried about what the doctor is going to tell them. They're worried about their immediate future, of course, but they're also worried about their family or loved ones or maybe people who depend on them. And so the most important thing I think that I can do is be honest and upfront with them and tell them what's going on with their bodies, why they feel the way they feel, and what we can do to help them. And I think people respect that. If you talk to people on an equal level and not talk down to them or use words that you know they're not going to understand, and are frank with them and have an open discussion about their health, I think most people respect that. And whether they follow through or not with what you're asking them to do is really a decision that they make, but at least they make it from the perspective of understanding what's going on with their own bodies. And that's the thing that I focus on. I do think that most people appreciate it when physicians are honest and when they tell them whether or not they can help them. And most importantly, they address the concerns they have about their families and loved ones, and how to deal with that. And sometimes we have to give devastating news to people, but it's the same thing. I think if you're open and honest with them and you talk to them in a one-on-one way and you respect them for who they are as a human being, I think they're much more willing to accept the information you're giving them.
How important is listening?
Oh my goodness. Well, you're in the business, you know that. It's everything. It's absolutely everything. 90%, and we learned this in medical school, 90% of a diagnosis, no matter how complicated it is, can be made based on what people tell you. The physical exam is only 10% of determining what's going on with someone. 90% is really based on what they're telling you. And the more open you are with them, and the more you allow them to express how they're feeling in an honest way, the more likely it is you're going to come up with a proper diagnosis and treatment for them.
A fascinating discussion. I don't know where the time has gone, but it's gone. And unfortunately, and I hope that we can do this again. The book is Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems by B.W. Williams, the author, and our guest on the program. Book available at all of the usual places. Amazon link on our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Again, a thanks to mainspringsbooks.com for arranging a conversation today. Excellent job in writing, excellent reviews. I'm sure you have many more stories. Will there be another book?
Yes, I'm working on one right now that
Good.
takes place in Philadelphia. So I'm hoping that this works out just as well.
Well, and I hope we have a chance to talk about that and so much more. Dr. Williams, a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on the success of Cityscapes. Hopefully we can do this again. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Rick.
It has been
Thank
our
you.
Pleasure. Cityscapes, Anthology of Urban Short Stories and Poems. B.W. Williams, the author. Book available at Amazon, all of the usual places. A link online, our website, thisweekinamerica.us. You're listening to This Week in America, and we're back after these messages.
This Week in America is online. You can visit our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Scott Pinkerton, associate producer of This Week in America. Jay Anderson, segment producer. Ben Watson, webmaster. Otto Bechet, director of engineering and TV production. This Week in America produced and is a trademark of Blue Funk Broadcasting, LLC. For information on all of our guests and to listen to this week's show, our website again at thisweekinamerica.us. And I'm Sean Bratton, executive producer of This Week in America.